Hello and welcome to this episode of Compensation Insider. Today, I'd like to take you through a question that I received from one of my readers a few years ago. And I thought that his question is a total evergreen, recurring type of question. So I would share with you the advice that I gave to him. So his name is Bardot, and his question was, is there wisdom to paying incentives annually versus semi-annually or quarterly? And that's all I received as a question. So obviously, it's a little bit vague because he doesn't describe anything about his current scheme, nor the reason why he may want to consider the change. But generally speaking, here's what to consider when you decide on the payout cycle for your incentives. So the first one is, does this timing tie to the business cycle? The payment should be as close as possible to the point in time when the triggering event was delivered by the employee. So for example, if you're talking about a sales incentive, if it's a short sales cycle, for example, selling cell phones, a monthly, maybe even a quarterly payment would make sense. But if it's a long sales cycle, for example, if you're selling complex, I don't know, software solutions, an annual payout or a semi-annual payout might make more sense. For support functions like legal, marketing, finance, HR, for example, most companies will pay on an annual basis because the objectives and the projects tend to be delivered over a longer period of time. So the annual payment makes sense with the cycle of business and objectives that are associated for the employee. The second point to consider is, does it make sense from a calculation point of view to pay on a annually, semi-annual, or quarterly basis? So for example, if some of the KPIs or the objectives take a lot of time for collection and verification, then a short payout cycle will not necessarily make sense because it might increase the risk of having to change the payment up or down based on the final, completely revised results. So if your ERP only reports on certain metrics on a quarterly basis, you can't pay a bonus tied to those objectives on a monthly basis because you will not have data to calculate the amount to pay. So just the technical aspects of the calculation and the data availability is going to drive part of that answer. And the third point to consider is the amount. So is it worthy of payment? Like, for example, I mean by this that it has to be worthy both for the employees and for the company. If the total annual amount of the incentive is quite low compared to the annual base pay, is it really useful to cut it in smaller payouts like quarterly? Probably not, because it's not going to be significant enough to have any kind of motivational effect for the employee. If you think that the payout would be large enough to be perceived positively by the employees, then you should consider potentially paying them a more frequent basis. Otherwise, you're spending money for nothing. And if the amounts are small and they touch a vast number of your employees, does it make sense to run them multiple times a year because it induces costs for the company, preparing, checking the amounts, the data input in payroll, the checking with finance, the time that HR is going to spend on that, and so on. So really think of those three aspects. Does the time when you want to pay, the frequency tied to the business cycle, does it make sense? Can you calculate it properly? And is the amount worthy of payment? Now, those are general principles, but regarding your specific company, if you're wondering, you would maybe consider why the company wants to potentially change the payment from, let's say, quarterly to annual or annual to quarterly or semi-annual. This will help you to decide if the move from the quarterly payout to the annual payout makes sense. It's not about theory. This is much more about how such a change could impact your organization beyond the simple change in the payment date. Has something changed in the rhythm of the business? Or is this something based simply on convenience because HR and finance don't want to spend time working on these quarterly payments? Is it because the company is facing some financial challenges in terms of cash flow? And if so, is it a permanent or a temporary change in the payment provision? And also, how will you maintain trust with the employees and guarantee that the company will be able to pay at the end of the year? And you may also want to see that you consider legal considerations, because sometimes contracts do mention a quarterly payment. So if you want to make a change, you might have to check with your legal team. You have to also think about how the change in rhythm, and especially if you're going to pay less frequently, is going to impact the cash flow of employees and their capacity to pay their day-to-day expenses, how it's going to impact their morale, their motivation, their engagement, their productivity, and the kind of communication that you will give to them, and who will own that decision for the change. So in my opinion, this kind of change, the communication should come from line management, not from HR, to make it not a bureaucratic decision, but to explain why it was driven by certain business circumstances to change that, rhythm of payment. So as you can see, a payout cycle has many components. It's not just a change of date. It often ties into some kind of change in the philosophy about how the organization pays its employees. So you can't just do it and send an email to inform employees, because otherwise you will have potentially, like discontent and then unwanted employee attrition if you don't put together a proper plan to handle the situation. So whichever way you decide to go, you need to be ready to explain it and communicate it in a proper manner. I hope you found this useful, and if you have ever changed the rhythm at which you were paying out on some incentives, and you have some stories that you would like to share, please don't hesitate, leave a comment and share your story with everyone. Thank you very much, and see you next week.